They try to steal his land, his property, his title, and his wealth. But it wasn't all, as they were having their malevolent eyes on love of his life. So this man in a vulnerable position decides to fight back. He sets on a path to take inexplicable revenge. Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me. A slave, beaten to the brink of death by his cruel master, was dragged by two subordinates to a large iron cage. After receiving a nod from the master, they flung the slave into the cage and locked it tight. Without hesitation, the subordinates returned with a bucket of scalding hot water. As the choir sang in the background, they poured the steaming water over the slave, whose agonizing screams echoed through the night, piercing the air. The guest, shocked by the horrifying sight, watched in stunned silence. Yet, the master, Des Shinkle, was far from satisfied. He ordered his men to repeat the act. The second bucket of boiling water brought the slave's screams down to a whimper. The children in the choir, terrified, retreated indoors, leaving the square in a chilling silence. By the time the third bucket was emptied, the slave's voice had vanished completely. At this point, the butler discreetly informed Des Shinkle that the guests were visibly uncomfortable, but Des Shinkle paid no heed and demanded a fourth bucket of hot water. Just then, two men, Colin and Ekin, stood up, ignoring Des Shinkle's protests. They opened the iron cage and pulled the lifeless slave out. Colin gently laid the body on his horse and rode back to his farm. His wife, who was working on the farm, saw her husband's lifeless body and, with tears streaming down her face, mourned his loss. However, she was powerless against the ruthless Des Shinkle, who was a well-known landowner with powerful connections to the king. No one dared to challenge Des Shinkle's cruelty in this land. Colin was a retired military captain who once lived in a rundown veteran's slum. In an effort to increase national revenue, the king had sent people to colonize the Jutland wasteland, hoping to establish a new settlement. However, the harsh climate, poor soil, and constant threat of bandits in the forests had caused previous attempts to fail. Despite this, Colin volunteered to reclaim and cultivate the land. Due to his lowly origins, his father's identity was unknown, and his mother was a maid in a mansion. Colin wasn't taken seriously by the ministers. They believed the wasteland was barren and unfit for cultivation, and had no intention of investing more funds into the project. Unexpectedly, Colin assured them that he wouldn't need any financial support, as his captain's pension would suffice. However, he demanded that if his efforts succeeded, the king would grant him a noble title, his own manor, and servants. Reluctantly, the ministers agreed, given that Colin wasn't using any national funds and that the king had given the order. Colin set out alone to the Jutland wasteland, tirelessly exploring every inch of it in search of fertile land. During this time, he encountered bandits, one of whom, named Ominous, tried to distract Colin, while another bandit launched a sneak attack. Fortunately, Colin, being a seasoned soldier, quickly dispatched the attacker, causing Ominous to flee in fear. After some time, Colin finally found a patch of suitable land. He contacted local workmen and Eklund, to help him build a house. Eklund introduced Colin to a farmer couple slaves who had escaped from Des Shinkle's estate. The husband, Erickson, was skilled in farming, while his wife, Barbara, was an excellent housekeeper. The couple had fled Des Shinkle's estate because he had an eye on Barbara's beauty. Though Colin knew that hiring slaves was illegal, he decided to employ the couple, considering their dire situation, and as a favor to Eklund. 4 months later, Colin's house was complete, and he named it King's House. Meanwhile, Des Shinkle heard about Colin's new home in the wasteland. Although the surrounding land was part of his territory, Des Shinkle hadn't bothered to cultivate it, but he wouldn't allow anyone else to do so either, fearing that his authority might be challenged. However, Colin was not entirely at peace in his new manor. The bandit Ominous he had encountered earlier occasionally sneaked in to steal chicken, since she had dark skin and was associated with bandits. The manor staff were too frightened to confront her. Frustrated, Colin hung a series of bells around the perimeter to deter her from stealing again. One day, while Barbara was preparing to do laundry, she noticed two figures approaching in the distance. She quickly recognized Major Pricer, who was clearly sent by Des Shinkle. Barbara and Erickson hid in fear, but to their relief, Pricer's purpose was not to capture them. Instead, he had been sent by Des Shinkle to invite Colin to Holder Manor for dinner. Knowing he couldn't afford to offend such a powerful man, Colin reluctantly agreed. He arrived at Holder Manor dressed in his full military uniform. In the grand hall, Colin met Adele, Des Shinkle's cousin. Her father was a close friend of the king wedding and had always hoped she would marry Des Shinkle. However, Adele disliked Des Shinkle, who was arrogant and cruel. During dinner, Des Shinkle subtly insulted Colin's humble origins and emphasized his own noble title. But the insults didn't stop there. Des Shinkle was even more direct, demanding that Colin acknowledge his ownership of the wasteland. He even had his butler draft a contract that would require Colin to give Des Shinkle 50% of his income. Moreover, if Colin's reclamation efforts succeeded, all future settlers would become Des Shinkle's tenants. Before Colin could leave the castle, Adele offered to help him with his horse. She had never seen anyone dare to stand up to Des Shinkle before. After a brief conversation, she invited Colin to attend the harvest festival in a month's time and gave him her handkerchief as a token of her favor. The next day, when Colin returned to his farm, he discovered that nearly all of his workers had left, except for Erickson and Barbara. The other workers had been lured away by Des Shinkle with promises of higher wages. They tried to persuade Colin to give up, insisting that no one dared to oppose Des Shinkle in this place. But Colin remained confident. He had the king's seal, and he believed that the law would protect him. After stealing all of Colin's workers, Des Shinkle's butler investigated Colin's finances and discovered that he only had 100 kroner left in his retirement fund. If no one helped Colin clear the land, he would be forced to sign the contract by winter. Hearing this, Des Shinkle was pleased and sent Colin a mocking gift, a little mannequin, meant to ridicule his low status. With no workers left, Colin came up with a bold plan. That night, he hid in the shadows of his house, waiting for Onmanus to come and steal food. When she did, Colin sprang into action and caught her, holding her at gunpoint. Colin demanded that Onmanus lead him to the bandits' hideout. Under Colin's repeated threats, Onmanus finally agreed. Early the next morning, Colin followed her directions and arrived at the bandits' lair. To his surprise, the bandits were actually nomadic Romani people. Upon seeing Onmanus leading Colin to their hideout, the Romani became wary, especially since Colin was a retired soldier. When Colin explained his purpose, the Romani people laughed. They knew that the country's laws had long abandoned them. If Colin employed them, he could end up in prison. But Colin was beyond caring. To show his sincerity, he even handed over his military medal to the Romani leader. Thus, a grand land-clearing effort began, with everyone working diligently under Erickson and Colin's direction, a scene that was witnessed by Pricer. That night, everyone gathered to drink and celebrate. Onmanus even performed a dance for Colin, throwing a stick tied with a red string in front of him. She asked him to pick it up, explaining that if he did, he would become a member of her clan. Colin, understanding the significance, remained silent for a moment before gently placing the stick back on the ground. He didn't want to become too involved with Onmanus and her people just yet. Seeing the stick lying there, Onmanus appeared somewhat saddened. The next day was the harvest festival. Des Shinkle learned from his butler that Colin had not only employed the Romani people to clear the land, but had also hidden Barbara and her husband at the manor. Before going to Holder Manor, Colin asked Erickson to buy some white clay from the coast. Then, he dressed carefully in grand attire and arrived at the manor. True to form, Des Shinkle didn't miss an opportunity to mock Colin, using the excuse that his wig was amusing and forcing him to wear a wig he had prepared. As everyone was mingling, a servant approached Colin and informed him that Miss Adele was waiting for him by the river. Colin went to meet her, and they talked. It became clear that Adele didn't like Des Shinkle. She was genuinely interested in Colin. Adele's father, however, was a greedy man. If Colin succeeded in reclaiming the wasteland, Adele would be willing to marry him. The two made a simple agreement by the river. What Colin didn't expect was that Des Shinkle would have Erickson captured and then brutally scalded him to death in front of the dinner guests. Witnessing this horrific act, Colin was deeply saddened but helpless. He could only take Erickson's body back to the manor. When Barbara saw her husband's lifeless body, she was devastated. It was hard to believe that the man who had been by her side that very morning was now gone forever. Erickson's death sent shockwaves through the Romani people who were working for Colin, fearing that Des Shinkle would target them next. They fled Colin's manor overnight, taking their clan members with them. Barbara, now a widow, initially wanted to leave too, but Colin pleaded with her to stay. He couldn't manage the fields and the household alone and needed Barbara to continue as the housekeeper. Barbara's grief over her husband's death turns into a burning desire for revenge. At his grave, she resolves to confront Des Shinkle, a powerful figure who would lose influence if a new settlement is established on the wasteland. Back at the manor, Barbara negotiates for double her previous pay from Colin, who sweetens the deal with a promise of 10% of the profits. Colin reveals his plan to plant potatoes in the poor soil of the wasteland, knowing that as long as they are kept warm, the crops will thrive. That night, Onmanus, a woman who had fled from the Romani people to avoid being sold again, returns to the manor. The household now consists of Colin, Barbara, and Onmanus. As winter approaches, Colin clears a small plot of land to prepare for potato planting. Snow soon covers the wasteland, and Onmanus contracts tuberculosis. Barbara prepares medicine, but the lack of proper nutrition puts Onmanus' life at risk. Colin, hardened by circumstances, refuses to cook the few potatoes they have. Des Shinkle learns that Colin Colin has imported potatoes from Germany and, fearing Colin's success, visits King's house with food and 2,000 kroner to persuade Colin to leave. Despite the temptation, Colin returns the money and the leftovers to Des Shinkle the next morning. Onmanu's health deteriorates, and Colin reluctantly slaughters their last goat for food, despite Barbara's reminder of the goat's value. With proper nourishment, Onmanu's recovers. Barbara shows kindness by giving her all the blankets and even visiting Colin's room. As winter ends, Colin plants the potatoes, and a small green sprout gives him hope. Onmanu's, grateful, offers Colin a stick tied with a red string, which he accepts. Just as things seem to improve, a hailstorm nearly destroys their crops. However, a small sprout survives, and soon, Colin sends 80 sacks of potatoes to the king, who rewards him with settlers, supplies, and an official appointment as a royal surveyor. Life improves for Colin, Barbara, and Onmanu, who becomes part of the family. However, Des Shinkle's jealousy reaches a breaking point. Ignoring his cousin Adele's advice to avoid conflict, he grows increasingly unstable, even murdering a maid in a fit of rage. Des Shinkle hires death row inmates to cause havoc. One night, Onmanu wakes from a nightmare, and Colin discovers that his horse has been killed and wolves are attacking their poultry. Colin finds the bodies of 3 immigrants the next morning, confirming Des Shinkle's involvement. Colin confronts Des Shinkle, who denies any wrongdoing. Despite his anger, Colin refrains from violence. After the funeral for the immigrants, Adele informs Colin about the death row inmates hired by Des Shinkle. Colin approaches the immigrant leader for support in seeking revenge, but the leader blames Onmanu's, believing her darker skin marks her as a devil's incarnation. Reluctantly, Colin agrees to expel Onmanu's in exchange for the immigrants' help, though Barbara strongly disagrees. Onmanu's, heartbroken but not blaming Colin, leaves for a monastery where she can work for food. That night, Colin and the immigrant leader disguise themselves and eliminate the death row inmates, though Pricer escapes to inform Des Shinkle. The next morning, Colin returns to find that Barbara has left a note stating she won't return because of Onmanu's departure. Meanwhile, Des Shinkle seeks the ruling minister's help, and they agree to redistribute the reclaimed wasteland, giving 90% of the profits to the state. Pricer leads the army to King's house to arrest Colin for murder. In the ensuing chaos, Eklund is killed, and Colin is overpowered and taken to Holder Manor, where Des Shinkle tortures him. Barbara, disguised as a maid, infiltrates Holder Manor and sedates Des Shinkle. With Miss Adele's help, Barbara stabs Des Shinkle, but she is captured by the guards. Colin, still trapped in a cage, watches her arrest with mixed emotion. Miss Adele leaves for Norway, and Colin regains control of King's house. However, Barbara is sentenced to life in a Lard prison. Colin brings Onmanu's back to the manor, where she grows into an adult and manages most of the affairs. Colin receives a royal decree conferring upon him the title of Baron, permanent land use rights, and other benefits, but he still feels empty without Barbara. Years pass, and Onmanu's falls in love with a Romani boy who proposes marriage. Colin, recognizing her right to happiness, gives his approval, and Onmanu's leaves the manor with her boyfriend. Colin decides to seek his own happiness, relinquishing his noble title and leaving the manor. Meanwhile, Barbara, blindfolded and waiting for her transfer to Copenhagen slave prison. She sits behind Colin on a horse, her hands tightly clasping his waist as they ride together into an uncertain future. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel out. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below with your suggestions for future videos, any questions you have, or just to say hi. Your feedback is super important to us and helps us create better content for you. Also, feel free to share this video with your friends, family, and on social media. It really makes a big difference and helps our community grow. You can follow us on Insert your social media handles for more updates and behind-the-scenes content. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.